By the time Alexander Kane's charcoal gray Aston Martin pulled into the circular drive, the Chicago twilight had turned the windows of his Gold Coast mansion into dark, unreadable mirrors. He stayed behind the wheel for a moment, drumming 2 fingers against the leather, watching the house that had once been a home. 28 days. That was how long he had been living across town with Julian Cross. He called it temporary. Julian had returned to Chicago after a catastrophic breakup, the kind that left an Omega hollow-eyed and shaking, the kind that made a person forget how to hold a coffee cup without spilling. His condo renovation had gone wrong in spectacular fashion. The contractor had vanished with a deposit, and Julian had called Alexander from a hotel lobby at midnight, voice ragged, asking if he had anywhere safe to go. Alexander had offered the corporate apartment on West Randolph. Then he had stayed the first night because Julian couldn't stop trembling. The second because the nightmares were so bad the Omega woke screaming, his sense soured with terror, and Alexander had held him until dawn because that was what you did for someone you had loved first. By the end of the first week, Alexander's suits occupied half the closet in that sterile corporate space. The doorman greeted them like a couple. Julian started leaving out a second coffee mug in the morning. Alexander told himself he was giving Leo time to cool down. Leo had become impossible lately. Asking why Julian had a company expense account without a contract. Why Alexander took business calls on the balcony like he was hiding something. Why an alpha married to someone else should be sleeping 3 miles away with his first love. Questions. 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 Alexander had wanted peace. The truth, the one he refused to examine, was that peace had always looked like Leo. Leo, who answered his midnight emails. Leo, who fixed his presentations and remembered his coffee order and never complained about the investors who called it dinner. Leo, who had been so reliable for 8 years that Alexander had stopped seeing reliability as a gift and started seeing it as infrastructure. The lamp that turned on. The tea that appeared. The presentation that got fixed. The client who got calmed down. Alexander's life remained warm and polished and ready for him whenever he walked back into it. He had mistaken reliability for captivity. Now the house was dark, and Leo was gone. Alexander unlocked the front door and stepped into silence. Leo. His voice echoed off the marble floor. Nothing. The entry light came on automatically, illuminating a console table stripped bare. The ceramic bowl Leo used for keys was gone. The framed photograph from their mating ceremony had vanished, leaving a pale rectangle in the dust. The air smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and nothing else. No cedar candle. No garlic from the kitchen where Leo always cooked even when Alexander said he didn't have to. No barely their scent of honey and cedar that had always meant home to Alexander's alpha instincts. He walked through the living room. The blanket Leo always wrapped around himself during late nights at the office was gone. The stack of architecture magazines was gone. The shallow ceramic dish where Leo tossed his wedding ring before bed was gone. Every warm thing had been removed. The refrigerator held sparkling water, mustard, 2 lonely limes, and nothing else. No labeled containers. No emergency dumplings Leo claimed were for himself, but always made twice as many. Because you'll want some at midnight. Alexander's irritation sharpened into something harder. He went upstairs. The bedroom was made so tightly it looked staged. Leo's side table was bare. The closet was half empty. Leo had taken the hangers too. His shoes were gone. His winter coats. The soft gray sweater he wore whenever he worked from home. The one Alexander loved because it smelled like him and made the Omega look impossibly young and soft. The shelves where Leo kept his bags showed clean lines in the dust. Alexander stood there longer than he meant to. Leo had moved out. The thought landed badly, like someone had changed the floor beneath him without permission. That was when he saw the envelope on the coffee table. The first page read, Petition for dissolution of mating bond and proposed marital settlement terms. Leo's signature appeared at the bottom in the clean, forward-leaning handwriting Alexander knew from hundreds of design notes. No emotional letter. No accusation. Only a tabbed packet with sticky notes marking the places where his lawyer could respond. Even his exit was organized. Alexander tossed the papers onto the table. "Give it a week," he muttered. Nobody answered. Leo had always stayed. He stayed through missed dinners, canceled anniversaries, product launches, zoning hearings, client disasters. Leo stayed so consistently that Alexander had stopped experiencing it as a choice. It became infrastructure. He had mistaken reliability for captivity. A memory surfaced. Leo kneeling on the floor of his office years ago, sorting binders while Alexander complained about a lender. Leo's fingers had been red from the cold, and he had looked up and said, "You know, one day I'm charging consulting rates for this." Alexander had kissed the top of his head and replied, "You're my omega. Your rate is unlimited takeout." At the time, Leo had laughed. Alexander suddenly could not remember whether the laugh had reached his eyes. His phone buzzed. "Julian, did you find the binder? I made pasta. Don't be late." He stared at the message, then at the divorce packet. He should have called Leo instead. Pride moved faster. He went to the study, found the binder in the bottom drawer, and left the packet on the coffee table. As he locked the front door, he told himself Leo wanted a reaction. If he refused to give one, Leo would eventually call. He would say he had overreacted. They would meet somewhere private. Alexander would explain that Julian needed support, and that adults could care about more than one person without turning everything into betrayal. Leo would hate the explanation. Then he would accept it, because he had always accepted the life Alexander offered. The next morning, Alexander walked into Kane Urban Group at 8:15 and summoned his executive assistant. "Send Leo up." The assistant's face changed in a way that made Alexander's stomach tighten. "I don't think he's here, sir. He's never late. Call him." A minute later, the head of human resources appeared, carrying a folder against her chest. Alexander's patience snapped. "Why is HR in my office? Where's my husband?" "Mr. Kane, Leo resigned 15 days ago." The room went very quiet. Alexander stared at her. The words didn't make sense. Leo was the design director. Leo was the reason Kane Urban had won 2 municipal bids that year. Leo was the Omega who had built the firm's reputation while Alexander made the speeches. He completed his notice period, returned company equipment, transferred active files, and signed the exit certification. 11 members of the senior design team also resigned over the following 2 weeks. Their dates were staggered. Legal reviewed each departure. Alexander's hand slipped from the edge of his desk. "Resigned to go where?" The HR director's eyes flickered. "Northline Studio." Northline was the rival firm that had taken 2 municipal bids from Kane Urban that year. Northline was run by Adrian Shaw, an alpha who had built his reputation on stealing talent and making it look like strategy. 11 people left without you organizing it. Alexander demanded. Their reasons included your comments about their division being a cost center. The HR director's voice was carefully neutral. Alexander's jaw tightened. "Get the car." "Northline." "Now." Northline Studio occupied a renovated printing warehouse near the river. Its lobby smelled of coffee, concrete dust, and money trying very hard not to look like money. Alexander walked past the receptionist, ignored her protests, and followed the sound of voices into an open project area. Leo stood near a large screen, finishing a presentation. For one disorienting second, Alexander did not recognize him. Leo wore a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows and charcoal trousers that fit him like a second skin. His hair was pulled back without the loose softness he favored at home. A pencil sat behind one ear, and his scent was muted, controlled. He spoke with quiet authority while 12 people took notes. "Final visual package by 10 tomorrow," Leo said. "No panic revisions at 2 in the morning. If the schedule fails, tell me before it fails. Heroics are not a workflow." An Omega at the table raised a hand. "What if the client sends feedback at midnight? Then the client can enjoy the thrilling experience of receiving a reply at 9. Laughter moved through the room. Alexander remembered all the nights Leo answered his clients at midnight because Alexander had promised them he would. The sight of Leo standing in another company, making rules he had never allowed Leo to make, lit something ugly in him. "Leo, The room went silent. Leo turned. His expression did not change. Alexander crossed the floor. You resigned without speaking to me. I spoke to HR, legal, finance, every client contact requiring transition notice, and my attorney. The only person I didn't speak to was the Alpha who had been living with another Omega for a month. Several people suddenly became fascinated by their laptops. Alexander lowered his voice. You want to do this in front of your new coworkers? Leo tilted his head. You came into my workplace without an appointment. That was a strange choice for a man so concerned about privacy. Heat rose under Alexander's collar. You brought Kane employees here. They resigned individually. Some received offers from Northline, some went elsewhere. Nobody was forced. You planned this. I protected myself against a CEO who thinks marriage converts an Omega's authorship into household property. Alexander grabbed Leo's wrist. Come home. Leo looked down at his hand. Let go. Not until we finish. Alexander. Let go. A voice behind them cut through. He asked you to let go. Adrian Shaw approached from the hallway. Northline's managing partner was an alpha with dark hair, sharp green eyes, and the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to announce itself. Alexander had met him twice. Neither meeting had improved either man. Unlike Alexander, Adrian didn't flare his pheromones or square his shoulders. He simply stood there, present and immovable, waiting. You're interfering in a marital matter, Alexander said. Adrian's gaze dropped to Alexander's hand on Leo's wrist. I'm interfering in a workplace matter. You're making a scene in my office, and you're touching one of my employees without consent. Let him go. Now. The words were calm. They didn't need to be loud to land. Alexander released Leo. Red marks already ringed Leo's skin. Something shifted in the Omega's face. Not fear, but recognition, as if the moment had confirmed a conclusion he had already reached. Adrian gestured toward the glass conference room. You have 10 minutes. The door stays open. I don't need your permission. No, Leo said. You need mine. He walked into the conference room and sat at the far side of the table. Alexander followed. Leo slid a copy of the divorce proposal toward him. Have your lawyer respond. I'm not signing. Alexander. Julian is not what you think. Then what is he? He came back with nowhere to go. He owns a condo in Vancouver. His parents have a house in Windermere. And Kane Urban paid for 30 nights in a furnished apartment. Leo raised one eyebrow. Was the entire continent unavailable? Alexander's face heated. You used to care whether I looked foolish. I used to cover for you. The difference is that one was love, and the other was unpaid crisis management. Come back. I'll deal with Julian. I'll make you executive vice president. Full control of design. A board seat. Equity. Leo stared at him. You are offering me the authority I earned years ago as payment for returning to the marriage. That isn't what I mean. It is exactly what you mean. You still believe every problem has a package. I'm trying to show you I value you. You value the things that disappeared when I did. Alexander flinched. Leo's voice softened, which somehow hurt more. If I had moved out but left my team, my client trust, and my frameworks behind, would you be sitting here asking what I needed? Alexander didn't answer. Leo nodded. That is why we are done. The elevator doors opened. Alexander made one last attempt. Give me 3 months. For what? To prove I can change. You should change if you believe the alpha you became is unacceptable. Not as a purchase price for me. Leo stepped into the elevator. Stop giving me new reasons to be relieved I left. The doors closed between them. Alexander stood there, frozen, until Adrian's voice pulled him back. Your 10 minutes are over. The alpha hadn't moved from his position near the conference room. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't look smug. He simply looked like a man who had watched a scene and drawn his own conclusions. Alexander turned on him. This isn't over. Adrian's expression didn't change. It is for now. You're on private property. You've already threatened one of my senior staff, and if you come here again without an appointment, security will remove you. He paused. And if you touch Leo again, I will have you trespassed and pursue a restraining order. I don't care who you are. He's my husband. He was your husband. Adrian's voice was flat. He resigned from your company. He filed for divorce. He moved out of your house. The only person still using the present tense here is you. Alexander stepped closer, his alpha instincts bristling. Stay away from him. Adrian didn't step back. He didn't flare his own pheromones to match Alexander's challenge. He simply stood there, calm and unmoved. I'm not going to make you any promises about who I stay away from. But I will tell you this. Whatever happens between Leo and me, if anything happens, it will be because he wants it. Not because I cornered him. Not because I confused kindness with obligation. The quiet emphasis on the last word hit Alexander like a slap. Get out of my office, Adrian said, or I'll have security walk you out. Alexander left. In the elevator, his phone buzzed twice with messages from Julian. He put the phone away and stared at the closed doors, trying to remember when Leo had last looked at him the way he had looked at Adrian. With something like trust. He couldn't. That afternoon, Alexander returned to Kane Urban to find 2 more client review notices waiting on his desk. At 5:15, Finance flagged an expense report involving Julian's consulting access. At 6, Julian arrived at the office carrying a silver thermos of chicken soup. He swept past reception in a cream dress, entering the board conference room without knocking. Alexander, you skipped lunch again. 6 directors turned to look at him. Julian stopped. The thermos tilted in his hand. On the screen behind him, a spreadsheet listed $486,700 in consulting fees, vehicle charges, luxury apartment costs, private event expenses, and vendor payments linked to his name. Ruth Palmer, the director who chaired the audit committee, glanced at the thermos. Well, at least one department still has full-service staffing. Nobody laughed. Julian recovered quickly. I've been helping with community outreach. Without an executed consulting agreement, Ruth said. Alexander approved it. Every head turned toward Alexander. He remembered Julian telling him about gallery owners and private club members who could help with Harbor Hotel. Alexander had opened a temporary vendor pathway and told his office to be flexible. Flexible had become $486,000. What deliverables did you provide? Ruth asked. Julian looked at Alexander. He hated that Julian looked at him. I introduced several people. Names. Julian's eyes flashed. I sent everything to the executive office. Alexander turned to his chief of staff. Did we receive reports? We received mood boards and an invitation list. Julian's face reddened. This is humiliating. Ruth's tone remained calm. That feeling is not an accounting category. The board ordered an independent audit. Julian's access was terminated. Alexander lost unilateral approval authority for vendors and executive expenses. When the meeting ended, Julian followed him into his office. You let them treat me like a criminal. They asked for records. Because Leo poisoned everyone against me. Leo is not on the board. He doesn't have to be. He leaves and suddenly every door closes. Alexander stared at him. You submitted expenses without support. And you approved them without reading. The truth of it landed between them. Julian grabbed his bag. You don't get to make me the only villain because you missed the Omega who made you look competent. He slammed the door. The next morning, Northline's communications team called Leo into a conference room. An anonymous account had posted photographs of Leo and Adrian leaving the office after 9 at night. The caption read, Some Omegas don't leave a husband. They transfer to a richer sponsor. A second post accused Leo of orchestrating a team raid and stealing projects while still married. Maya read the posts aloud, growing more creative with each sentence. Leo read them without changing expression. Save everything, he said. We already did, Adrian said from the doorway. Legal is preparing a demand letter, not an emotional statement. I wasn't planning one. Good. Maya stared at him. That's it. Good. What would you like me to do? Leo asked. Challenge Julian to a duel in Millennium Park. Adrian said, not legally advisable. Maya pointed at him. This is why no one invites lawyers to brunch. I'm not a lawyer. You speak in footnotes. Leo almost smiled. The response went out that afternoon. It included the dates of Leo's resignation, the team's individual departures, the return of Kane Urban equipment, and the contractual basis for client review. It denied any romantic relationship between Leo and Adrian during his marriage. It didn't need to mention Alexander's affair. An industry blogger published photographs of Julian entering and leaving the corporate apartment over 26 nights. Another source leaked a screenshot from Julian's private group chat. Leo is basically a building system, efficient, boring, and invisible until it breaks. Alexander only notices him because he keeps his life running. The public mood flipped in under 3 hours. Comments flooded Kane Urban's social pages. The thermos became a meme. Someone edited Julian's silver thermos onto a throne. Maya printed it and taped it above the Northline coffee machine. Leo made her remove it, then took a picture first. The humor helped for approximately 7 minutes. Then Alexander appeared outside Leo's apartment building. The doorman called upstairs. Leo looked at the video screen. Alexander stood beneath the awning in a dark coat, holding nothing. Tell him I'm unavailable. He says he'll wait. Then tell him the lobby closes to non-residents at 10. At 10:05, building security escorted Alexander outside. He waited in his car until dawn. Leo knew because the doorman told him the next morning with the solemn pride of a man who had personally defeated a siege. He looked terrible. Leo pressed the elevator button. So does the weather. I'm not inviting that upstairs either. At the office, Adrian placed coffee on Leo's desk. Security called me last night. Leo looked up. Why? I'm listed as Northline's emergency contact for executive staff. I didn't ask them to contact you. No. Adrian sat across from him. And I didn't go there. The distinction mattered. He didn't say he almost went. He didn't describe how angry he had been. He didn't turn restraint into a performance that required gratitude. Leo wrapped his hands around the cup. Thank you. Adrian nodded. Would you like the company to arrange additional building security? I'll think about it. Okay. He started to leave. Adrian. He turned. I am not fragile. I know. Sometimes people hear that I'm leaving a marriage and start treating me as if I might shatter next to the copier. I don't think you'll shatter. His mouth tilted. I think the copy machine should be careful. Leo laughed before he could stop himself. It was the first full laugh he had managed since leaving the house. Adrian's expression softened, but he didn't step closer. That more than the coffee stayed with Leo. The River District project review took place 3 days later. Kane Urban sat on one side of the table, Northline on the other. Alexander brought Victor Lang, a senior designer promoted overnight to acting design director. Leo arrived with Adrian and 4 members of his former team. He wore navy, no jewelry except a watch. He didn't look at Alexander when he sat down. The client chair opened the meeting. We are not here to litigate anyone's marriage. We are here because the contract names several key personnel who no longer work for Kane Urban. Kane has the opportunity to demonstrate continuity. Northline has been invited to present an alternative delivery plan. The first 10 minutes went well because Victor repeated the public parts of Leo's original proposal. Then the operations director asked, how does the night market traffic transition into the theater corridor without creating a bottleneck at the west entrance? Victor clicked backward through the slides. We would refine that during implementation. It was already modeled, the operations director said. Leo showed us 3 circulation scenarios last spring. Victor's face tightened. I'm still reviewing the archive. Alexander stepped in. That remains part of the vision. Where? We are determining the optimal location. By the time Kane Urban finished, the presentation had become a slow public discovery of how much the company had depended on people it never properly credited. Then Leo stood. He didn't insult Kane Urban. He didn't say Victor was unqualified. He didn't mention Alexander. He opened with the problem, not himself. The district fails if residents experience it as a weekend attraction built for visitors. It succeeds if the route works on a Tuesday in February when it is raining, the theater is dark, and a parent needs to get from the bus stop to the childcare center without crossing 3 loading zones. The room changed. Leo moved through circulation diagrams, local business leases, seasonal programming, and construction phases. Maya explained the visual identity. Lewis covered public space transitions. Priya presented procurement timing. Adrian addressed insurance and contract administration. In short, precise answers. Alexander watched Leo under the screen light and felt a disorienting blend of anger and awe. At home, Leo had become quieter each year. He stopped attending industry dinners. He let Alexander present their shared ideas. Alexander had told himself Leo preferred privacy. Now he saw the truth. Leo had not lost his light. He had stopped wasting it where it was treated as free electricity. After both presentations, the client requested a private discussion. Leo stood near a window speaking quietly with Priya. He smiled at something she said, brief and real. Alexander had not seen it directed at him in months. He walked over. "Were you already negotiating with Northline while employed by me?" Leo's smile disappeared. "I interviewed after giving notice." "You had the entire exit prepared." "I had a lawyer because my alpha moved in with another omega and gave him company access." "Yes, Alexander. I prepared. You could have talked to me." "I did. You called my concerns jealousy and said Julian was more emotionally mature. You're enjoying this." Leo studied him. "No. That is what you still don't understand. I'm not winning because you are losing. I am working. Your humiliation is not my project." The conference room doors opened. The client chair invited everyone back inside. "The project will be suspended for 7 business days while we complete a formal change review. Our preliminary preference is to negotiate a transfer of creative leadership to Northline." Alexander caught Leo outside, near the elevator. "You used to care whether I looked foolish. I used to cover for you. What is the difference?" "The difference is that one was love and the other was unpaid crisis management." The elevator doors opened. Adrian appeared beside them, holding a file. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, waiting, his presence steady and unthreatening. Alexander's alpha instincts flared. "Why is he always here?" Leo turned. "He's my boss. And unlike you, he doesn't use that as an excuse to follow me home." Adrian's voice was quiet. "Leo, the car's outside whenever you're ready." Leo stepped into the elevator. Adrian followed. Alexander watched the doors close, the mark on Leo's wrist from yesterday's grip still faintly visible. He had been so focused on proving Julian wasn't a threat that he'd missed the real one. The alpha who waited quietly and never had to grab. The River District contract transfer was approved the next week. Kane Urban retained a limited role for existing construction documentation, but Northline took creative leadership. Harbor Hotel initiated a new selection process. Western Arts Center stayed with Kane Urban but delayed the schedule. Kane Urban didn't collapse. It began to shrink where Alexander had assumed it was strongest. The audit found $3 million in unsupported payments routed through Julian's consulting company. The board suspended Alexander from day-to-day management, pending the full report. The announcement arrived while he sat alone in the house he once believed Leo could never leave. The refrigerator hummed. No lamp turned on for him. No dinner waited. His phone showed a message from Julian's lawyer demanding that Kane Urban preserve all communications. Another from Leo's attorney proposing a final settlement conference. Alexander opened the home delivery app and realized he didn't know his own address from memory because Leo had always ordered. He laughed once. Then, unexpectedly, he put his face in his hands. 3 weeks before River District's public opening, Chicago received the kind of rain that made every weather app sound personally offended. Water hammered the site for 14 hours. A temporary drainage barrier failed. Mud poured across a newly installed pedestrian path. 2 electrical cabinets shut down. The subcontractor called Leo with the sentence every project lead hates. "We may have a problem." Leo was on site in 40 minutes. The team gathered in rain jackets under a loading canopy while water streamed from the edges. For one dangerous second, old instincts took over. Leo began issuing orders faster than anyone could write them down. He called the civil engineer, the landscape contractor, the electrician, the client, and the insurance coordinator. Adrian arrived with coffee and was immediately handed a flashlight. "West Trench. Find out whether the pumps lost power or capacity." Adrian didn't move. What? Leo demanded. Who is coordinating the entire response? I am. Who is documenting decisions? I am. Who is watching safety while you solve drainage, electrical, client communication, insurance, and the weather? Leo glared at him. This is not the time for a leadership seminar. No. It is the time to stop becoming a single point of failure. The words struck hard because they were true. At Kane Urban, Leo had always been the person who caught every falling object. He had called it competence. Alexander had called it dependable. Now, in the rain, Leo was rebuilding the same trap with his own hands. He took one breath, then another. Maya, incident log and photo record. Lewis, pedestrian safety and barricades. Priya, contact the electrical engineer and confirm shutdown status. Adrian, client and insurance updates. I'll stay with civil and landscape. The team split. Nobody died because Leo delegated. The project didn't collapse because he stopped touching every task. By 4 in the morning, the rain eased. The electrical cabinets remained dry. The failed barrier had caused surface damage, but no structural failure. The west path would need to be removed and rebuilt. Opening would be delayed by 10 days. Leo stood in the mud, soaked through. The client chair approached under an umbrella. This is going to cost us. Yes. The contractor's temporary protection plan didn't meet the approved sequence. We'll document responsibility. But I also approved an accelerated schedule that left less recovery time than I should have allowed. Margaret studied him. You are admitting fault before anyone has blamed you. I am identifying it before anyone can hide it. Good. Give me a realistic plan by noon. Not an optimistic one. Leo nodded. At 8, he showered in Northline's gym, changed into clothes Maya kept in an emergency drawer, and presented the recovery schedule. The opening moved 10 days. Northline waived a portion of its accelerated management fee because Leo's scheduling decision had contributed to the risk. No one called Leo weak for admitting a mistake. No one took his title. No one handed his work to a more agreeable Omega. The experience changed something fundamental. Leo had left Alexander because he refused to be used. Now he understood that self-respect also required refusing to use himself. Later that morning, Adrian found him in the empty conference room, staring at the flood-damaged site model. Can I sit? Adrian asked. Leo nodded. Adrian sat across from him, not beside him, leaving space. You made the right call, Adrian said. The schedule pressure came from the client. You owned your part of it. That's leadership. I could have caught it earlier. Could you have? You were managing 12 people and a budget and a client who wanted everything faster. You caught it when it mattered. Then you fixed it. Leo looked at him. You always do that. Do what? Make me hear what I actually did, not what I failed at. Adrian was quiet for a moment. That's what I want people to do for me. So I try to do it for them. That's not how Alexander led. I know. Adrian's voice was soft. I've seen his work. It looks like yours. A pause. A question unspoken, but hovering. Leo answered it. It was mine. He presented it. I let him. Why? Because I thought that's what love meant. Making someone else look good. Carrying the weight so they didn't have to. Adrian's eyes held his. And now? Now I know love doesn't mean disappearing. It means being seen. By someone who wants to see. The words hung between them. Adrian didn't rush to fill the silence. He just sat there, steady, waiting. Leo's heart was beating faster than the rain had made it. Adrian. Leo. The alpha leaned forward slightly. I'm not going to do anything that makes you feel cornered. Not now. Not ever. I'm not going to make a move when you're still in the middle of leaving someone. That's not who I am. Then what are you doing? Adrian's smile was small and real. Waiting. And being here. That's all. It was the most terrifying and beautiful thing anyone had ever said to Leo. Because waiting was Alexander's least developed skill. And being present, truly present, without demand, was something Leo had never experienced. 2 months later, the court entered the divorce judgment. Leo received his share of the marital accounts and the home equity. Alexander agreed to reimburse a portion of marital funds used for Julian's rent, vehicle, jewelry, and personal travel. He kept his Kane Urban shares. Leo kept his premarital studio, intellectual property portfolio, and retirement assets. There was no dramatic gavel. The clerk handed over stamped copies, and an entire marriage became paper with a case number. Outside the courthouse, Alexander waited near the steps. He looked thinner. His suit fit badly now, as if his body had stopped cooperating with the image he wore. "I won't keep you," he said. Leo paused. "The board removed me as CEO. I heard. Kane will survive. Smaller. We're selling the hospitality division and cutting speculative development. I hope the employees land safely." Alexander gave a tired smile. "Still thinking about everyone else?" "No. I'm thinking about employees. That is not the same as thinking about you." Alexander's smile disappeared. He looked toward the courthouse doors. Julian reached a repayment agreement on some of the expenses. The vendor matters may still be referred to prosecutors. His consulting company is finished. Leo said nothing. "He says I ruined his life. You opened the door. He chose what to carry through it. And you? What about me? Did I ruin yours?" Leo thought of the empty house, the blocked messages, the red marks on his wrist, the nights he had edited proposals while Alexander slept across town. Then he thought of his new desk, the team laughing over bad coffee, and the River District plan spread under morning light. "No," he said. "You wasted some of my time. You taught me an expensive lesson. You hurt me, but you did not ruin me." Alexander's eyes reddened. "I am sorry. For all of it. For not seeing you. For assuming you'd always be there. For making you carry everything." Leo heard the sincerity. He believed it. Believing didn't require returning. "I hear you," Leo said. "Is that all?" "It is more than you gave me when I was asking." Alexander nodded slowly. "You always were better at standing alone than I wanted to admit. That was the problem. You admitted it. You just preferred me pretending otherwise." Leo walked toward the black sedan waiting at the curb. Adrian was in the passenger seat, not coming out, not claiming the scene. Maya was driving, waving far too enthusiastically through the windshield. Alexander noticed him. "Are you with?" Leo almost laughed. "Do you understand how predictable that question is?" "I'm asking." "No. Not that it is your business. He is my colleague and my friend. Will he become more? Maybe. Maybe not. My leaving you did not require a replacement, Alpha. I know. I'm just sorry it took losing everything to understand." Leo got in the car. Maya pulled into traffic. Nobody asked for details until Leo chose to speak. River District opened under clear skies. The restored warehouses glowed amber against the water. Food vendors filled the market lane. Children drew chalk constellations across the courtyard. An old steelworker cried when he saw photographs of the former factory mounted inside the public hall. A reporter asked Leo whether the project was his comeback. "No. A comeback suggests I disappeared. I was working the entire time. Some people simply stopped looking." The quote traveled far beyond the design press. Alexander watched the interview from a temporary office, 2 floors below the suite he once controlled. The independent audit was complete. Kane Urban survived, but not as the company he had ruled. The board sold its speculative hospitality portfolio, closed the executive apartment, terminated unsupported consulting arrangements, and merged the weakened design division with a smaller regional studio. Employees on active projects kept their jobs. Vendors were placed on payment plans. The firm's name remained, though Alexander's no longer appeared on the lobby wall. He was removed as chief executive and barred from operational authority for 3 years under the shareholder settlement. He kept a reduced ownership interest after refinancing personal guarantees. Julian agreed to repay a substantial portion of the unsupported consulting fees and surrendered the leased vehicle and jewelry purchased through disputed funds. 2 vendor payment matters were referred to authorities. His public relations business lost its largest clients after the audit findings, and his contradictory, unpaid companion video became a case study in how not to defend invoices. He was not sent to prison by a dramatic judge the next morning. Consequences came slower: bank notices, lawyer bills, settlement installments, former friends who stopped answering, search results that did not forget. One afternoon, Julian called Alexander from an unknown number. You owe me. For what? For becoming the alpha you wanted. Alexander sat in the small office and looked through the glass at employees who no longer stood when he walked past. I wanted someone who never challenged me. That was my failure. What you did with the access was yours. Julian was silent. Then he laughed bitterly. Leo taught you that line. No. Of course not. He taught you everything else, and you called it your own. The call ended. Alexander did not call back. That winter, he began working with a governance consultant and a therapist, because the board required the first, and his own shame finally required the second. He learned that regret was not the same as repair. Regret centered his pain. Repair required him to stop creating new pain for the Omega, who had escaped. So he stopped waiting outside Leo's building. He stopped sending long messages through lawyers. He signed the final property documents on time. When River District won a regional design award, he typed "congratulations" into a text message, stared at it for several minutes, then deleted Leo's old number and sent nothing. For once, silence was not neglect. It was respect. 2 years after the divorce, Leo left Northline to start his own firm. The decision startled the industry and didn't surprise Adrian at all. Leo had rebuilt the urban design practice, led for major projects, and helped Northline grow beyond the reputation of being the other firm in the Kane divorce. He was offered partnership. He declined. I want to build something smaller before it becomes large, he told Adrian. Something where authorship is recorded before success makes everyone forget who did the work. Adrian nodded. I wondered when you'd say it. You knew? You have been naming imaginary firms in the margins of meeting notes for 6 months. Leo closed his notebook. You read upside down. I contain multitudes. The name he chose was Reed Field Studio. Adrian invested nothing. That had been his idea. If I finance it while we are figuring out whatever this is, you will spend the next decade wondering whether the company is truly yours. What is this? Leo asked. Adrian considered with visible caution. An extended period of extremely respectful tension. Leo laughed. They had been dating for 8 months by then, though dating mostly meant dinners that began as project conversations and ended with both of them arguing over dessert. Adrian had waited until Leo no longer reported to him. He had disclosed the relationship to Northline's governance committee while Leo was still employed and removed himself from compensation decisions concerning Leo's final year. Not romantic, perhaps. Leo found it deeply attractive. Reed Field opened in a former neighborhood library with 12 employees, 8 large windows, 1 unreliable freight elevator, and a conference table purchased from a restaurant that had gone out of business. The first company meeting lasted 40 minutes. Leo projected 5 rules. 1. Every project would identify actual contributors, not only executives. 2. Original concepts would be documented and registered where appropriate. 3. No one would be rewarded for preventable all-nighters. 4. Caregiving gaps would not be treated as evidence of reduced ambition. 5. Any employee could challenge Leo's decision with evidence, preferably before the building flooded. Maya raised a hand. Can we challenge you without evidence if your outfit is bad? No. What if the outfit is actively harming morale? Submit photographs to HR. The room laughed. The studio's first year was not a montage of instant triumph. A museum client delayed payment for 90 days. A public bid was lost after Leo priced the work honestly, while another firm promised impossible speed. The freight elevator trapped a delivery driver and 6 boxes of tile samples between floors for 45 minutes. The driver emerged holding a sample board and announced, I have seen the space between worlds, and it has terrible lighting. They hired him later as facilities coordinator. Leo also made a mistake that cost the studio money. He agreed to redesign a community center under a vague scope because the nonprofit director reminded him of himself at 25, exhausted, earnest, and determined to save everyone. Requests multiplied. The schedule doubled. His team stopped laughing. At a staff meeting, Maya placed a red folder in front of Leo. What is this? He asked. Evidence. Inside were timesheets, scope changes, and messages Leo had answered at 2 in the morning. Leo felt defensive, then ashamed of feeling defensive. "You're right," he said. The room went still. He renegotiated the contract, wrote off part of the excess work, and apologized to the team without explaining how noble his intentions had been. Later, Adrian found him sitting on the library steps with a carton of noodles. "I recreated the exact system I said I hated," Leo said. "For one project. That is how systems begin." Adrian sat beside him. "And you corrected it when someone challenged you. That is how different systems begin." Leo handed him the noodles. "Do not say anything wise for the next 5 minutes. I can discuss the freight elevator." Perfect. Their relationship grew through similarly unglamorous moments. Adrian learned that Leo needed an hour of silence after large presentations. Leo learned that Adrian became impossible when hungry and kept protein bars in every bag, including formal luggage. Adrian hated decorative pillows. Leo bought one shaped like a zoning map specifically to annoy him. They argued about work boundaries when Adrian forwarded a potential client on a Sunday. Leo told him he did not want his personal life converted into business development. Adrian apologized, withdrew the introduction, and asked before forwarding opportunities again. Leo once canceled dinner 3 times during a deadline week. Adrian told him that respecting independence did not mean accepting neglect. Leo listened. They did not confuse the absence of control with the absence of responsibility. When Adrian proposed, it happened in Reed Field's new material library after everyone else had gone home. He didn't kneel immediately. First, he placed a folder on the table. Leo narrowed his eyes. "If this is a merger agreement, I am leaving. It is a draft cohabitation and financial boundary checklist. That is somehow worse. There is also a ring that helps." They laughed until the tension broke. Then Adrian became serious. "I do not want to absorb your life, Leo. I want to build beside it. We keep separate ownership in our companies. We use independent lawyers. We decide together what becomes joint. If the answer is no, the answer stays no." He opened the ring box. The band was simple. Inside were engraved 4 words, "Beside you, never over you." Leo's eyes burned. Adrian didn't reach for his hand. "May I?" he asked. Leo looked at the alpha who had once stood in a glass conference room and waited for his decision before intervening. "Yes," he said. "You may." The old house sold 3 years after Leo left it. Alexander had delayed listing first because he believed Leo would return, then because selling felt like admitting Leo would not. Eventually the costs became absurd, and the rooms remained as empty as the night he found the divorce papers. Leo's attorney notified him that one final box had been discovered in the bottom drawer of the home office. Leo considered sending a courier, then decided to go himself. Not for Alexander. For the version of himself that had lived there. Snow had begun falling when he arrived. The house looked smaller than he remembered, though the columns were still grand and the windows still expensive. A real estate agent waited inside with a box on the dining table. Alexander was not supposed to be there. He entered through the side door 10 minutes later, stopped when he saw Leo, and looked immediately toward the agent. "I thought the walkthrough was at 4. "It was moved," the agent said. "I sent an email." Alexander gave a humorless smile. "I appear to have a long history with unread emails." The agent found a reason to inspect the garage. Leo opened the box. Inside lay a project notebook from his first year at Kane Urban. The cover was stained with coffee. His younger handwriting filled the first page. Design should make ordinary life easier, not merely photograph better. He ran a thumb over the sentence. "I found it behind the old binders," Alexander said. "Thank you for keeping it. I didn't know it was there." "Then thank you for not throwing it away." Snow tapped the windows. Alexander stood across the table with both hands in his coat pockets. "I saw the announcement about Reed Field's award." "Thank you. And your engagement." Leo looked up. Alexander managed a small smile. "Congratulations." "Thank you." The words were polite, complete, not an invitation. Alexander nodded as if he had finally learned how to receive a closed door without throwing his weight against it. "I owe you an apology that isn't asking for anything," he said. Leo waited. I made your competence disappear into my identity. At work, I called your ideas the company's. At home, I called your care the natural behavior of an omega. When you objected, I treated the objection as the problem. Julian didn't create that in me. He swallowed. He benefited from it. I chose it. Leo had imagined this apology in the first painful weeks after leaving. In those fantasies, it changed everything. Alexander said the perfect words. Leo felt vindicated. Perhaps some locked part of him opened. Now the words landed gently and stayed where they belonged, in the past. That is true, Leo said. I know. Are you asking me to forgive you? No. Leo believed him. That is probably the first useful thing regret has taught you. Alexander gave a quiet laugh. Probably. They walked toward the front door together. The house echoed around them. At the threshold, Alexander looked back into the empty living room. Do you remember the blue bowl you kept on the console? The one you said looked chipped? I found it in a cabinet after you left. I donated it. Alexander's eyebrows rose. I came back for some things while you were away, Leo explained. The bowl was mine. I gave it to a shelter furnishing apartments. Alexander laughed again, this time genuinely. Of course you did. What? I spent 2 years wondering where it went. Somewhere a stranger has been throwing keys into the object that represented my emotional collapse. Leo smiled despite himself. It was a bowl, Alexander. I know that now. Outside, Adrian waited beside Leo's car, reading something on his phone. He looked up, but didn't approach. Alexander saw him and said, He waits well. He does many things well. I'm glad. Leo studied him. Years earlier, that sentence would have sounded like surrender designed to be admired. Now it sounded tired and sincere. He tucked the notebook under his arm. Take care of yourself. You too. Leo walked down the steps. Adrian opened the passenger door. Everything. Leo held up the notebook. One thing. Cold. A little. Adrian turned up the heat after they got in. He didn't ask what Alexander said until they had driven 3 blocks. How was it? Finished. Adrian nodded. Leo opened the notebook to the first page. I used to know exactly what I wanted my work to be. You still do. I forgot for a while. You remembered. Leo looked through the rear window. The house had disappeared behind snow and trees. He felt no urge to turn around. Before the sale, Alexander had done one thing Leo never expected. He sent the new owners a binder documenting every repair Leo had managed during the marriage. The roof warranty, furnace service, tree treatment, even the paint formula for the kitchen walls. At the front, he had written, Most of this house was cared for by Leo Reed. Please do not mistake my name on the deed for the whole history of the place. The real estate agent had shown Leo the note without knowing what it meant. Leo didn't call Alexander to thank him. The gesture was not a bridge. It was a correction. Late but accurate. As Leo stood in the hallway, he noticed the wall beside the stairs had been repainted. The faint dent from the night Alexander threw his keys after a failed financing meeting was gone. Leo had patched it himself the next morning while Alexander slept. He remembered feeling proud that nobody would know. Now he understood how much of his marriage had been patchwork performed before witnesses arrived. Did you ever know about the wall? He asked. Alexander followed his gaze. I found the repair receipt in your files after you left. I did it myself. Of course you did. Alexander's voice broke around the words. I'm sorry you had to become so good at making damage invisible. Leo looked at him. That apology belongs to the alpha who lived here. I can accept it for him. I cannot bring him back. I know. For once, Alexander did. Reed Field's 5th anniversary exhibition was called Return to Position. The title came from a phrase Leo used during project reviews. When a plan became too crowded with demands, decoration, or ego, he would point to the original goal and say, return the idea to its position. The exhibition filled a restored transit hall with models, films, community interviews, material studies, and photographs of public spaces before and after redesign. The largest section featured River District not as a perfect success story, but as a record of revisions, the flood damage, the rebuilt West Path, the student apprenticeship program, the vendors who stayed through winter, the mistakes that changed later work. At the entrance, a wall listed every contributor in equal type size. No executive names were enlarged. Maya stood beneath it with a glass of wine. I asked for at least one gold letter. You asked for your name in a moving spotlight, Leo said. Leadership fears innovation. Across the hall, Adrian was helping an elderly guest find the accessible route, even though 3 event staff members were available. He caught Leo watching and lifted his eyebrows. They had married the previous spring on the roof terrace of Reed Field. 24 guests, 1 dinner, no dramatic vows. Their prenuptial agreement had taken longer to negotiate than the flowers. Maya had called that the most emotionally responsible romance, and therefore the least marketable. Leo had never been happier. A young Omega designer approached with a portfolio clutched against his chest. Mr. Reed, yes. I'm in my final year at UIC. Could I ask what made you start your own studio? Leo could have given the polished answer. Authorship, culture, public interest design. Instead he said, I got tired of being useful in places where I was not respected. The student looked startled. Leo smiled. That was the beginning. The harder part was learning not to build another place that consumed people simply because I was the one in charge. How do you know when to leave? You often know earlier than you admit. The student nodded slowly. What if leaving feels like failure? Then ask whether staying requires you to become smaller every year. Leo glanced toward the contributor wall. If the answer is yes, leaving may be the first honest design decision you make about your own life. Later, Leo gave a short speech. He spoke about neglected spaces, invisible labor, and the danger of designing cities only for people with power. Then he looked out at his team. I once believed silence was maturity, he said. I believed that if I worked hard enough, loved patiently enough, and solved every problem before it became visible, respect would arrive on its own. The hall became still. It did not. What arrived was expectation. One Omega never complaining does not mean the system is kind. One team surviving repeated emergencies does not mean leadership is strong. One Omega carrying everything does not mean he should. Leo paused. The work of returning to ourselves is not glamorous. It is paperwork. Boundaries, rest, naming who contributed, apologizing when we repeat what hurt us, leaving doors open without allowing people to walk through them uninvited. Adrian stood near the back, smiling. So tonight, I am not celebrating a comeback. I am celebrating position. The right people named. The right work valued. The right boundaries held. Applause rose through the hall. Afterward, Leo walked outside for air. Snow had not begun, but the night carried winter in it. Adrian joined him with 2 cups of tea. You spoke in complete paragraphs, Adrian said. I'm concerned. It's an exhibition. They expect grammar. He handed Leo a cup. Inside, the event continued. Laughter, glasses, footsteps, the soft mechanical voice of an elevator announcing floors. Leo leaned against the stone railing. Do you ever worry, he asked, that we built our marriage too carefully? Adrian considered. We own separate companies, maintain separate professional counsel, schedule quarterly money conversations, and require consent before posting each other online. You're making it sound romantic. I haven't reached the shared grocery spreadsheet. Adrian laughed. He touched his cup to Leo's. No, I don't think careful is the opposite of love. I think careless was simply advertised better. Leo looked through the glass at the exhibition. His name appeared on one small line beside everyone else's. For years, he had wanted Alexander to choose him loudly enough that he would feel secure. Now he understood security differently. It was not being chosen once. It was being considered daily. A colleague who could disagree without stealing credit. A partner who could worry without issuing orders. A home where the light was left on because someone cared, not because one person was assigned to wait. When they returned inside, the student with the portfolio was showing Maya a sketch. Maya listened, then said, The logic is chaos, but the idea has excellent shoes. Leo shook his head. The student laughed instead of shrinking. That, Leo thought, was also a kind of design. Their marriage had not made either of them magically easy. 6 months after the wedding, Adrian accepted a speaking engagement on the same weekend. Leo had planned a quiet trip for them. Adrian had assumed the trip was flexible. Leo had assumed the invitation was not. The argument lasted 40 minutes and included the phrase calendar colonialism, which neither could later define. In the past, Leo would have swallowed disappointment and waited for resentment to become proof that he was unloved. Adrian would have solved the problem by offering a more expensive trip. Instead, they sat at the kitchen table the next morning and described what each had assumed. Adrian canceled the engagement because he had accepted it after their plans. Leo admitted he had presented the trip as casual while secretly treating it as important. They added a shared rule. Important did not have to mean dramatic, but it did have to be spoken. Maya heard the story and said, "Disgusting. Communication has destroyed another perfectly good tragedy." Leo kept the rule anyway. That was what made the life feel real. It contained no flawless replacement for Alexander, no reward alpha delivered by the universe for surviving the wrong alpha. It contained two imperfect adults required to notice each other in ordinary time. Years later, Alexander attended an industry summit where Leo was giving the keynote address. He sat near the back. Kane Urban still existed, smaller, steadier, and no longer his kingdom. After the governance restriction ended, the board offered him a non-executive advisory role. He accepted and did not ask for more. He had learned slowly and without applause that not every room required his control to validate his presence. Julian completed his repayment settlement. One vendor-related fraud charge ended in probation and restitution after he cooperated. He moved away from Chicago and rebuilt a quieter career that involved far less access to other people's expense accounts. Neither ruin nor redemption arrived in one dramatic scene. Life simply became narrower until Julian began making different choices. At the summit, Leo spoke about public design and invisible labor. Young architects filled the front rows. He listened to questions carefully, never using embarrassment as a teaching method. After the session, Alexander watched a nervous graduate show Leo a concept sketch. "The structure needs work," Leo said, "but the idea has light. Do not confuse an unfinished idea with a worthless one." The student's whole face changed. Alexander remembered Leo saying similar things to junior designers at Kane Urban. He had considered it normal management. He understood now that Leo had been building people while Alexander built an image. He didn't approach Leo. He sent one message from the number Leo had chosen not to block after the final property sale. "Congratulations. The keynote was excellent." A few minutes later, his phone lit up. "Thank you." 2 words. Polite. Distant. Whole. Alexander smiled, though his eyes burned. It was enough because it was all Leo chose to give. That winter, Leo returned to the old property one final time. Not to see Alexander, but because the new owners had found a second box in the attic. It contained early models, a cracked ruler, and a small ceramic house he had made in graduate school. The miniature had no front door. Adrian turned it over in his hands. "Experimental security. I was 23 and dramatic. You remain dramatic. I have better detailing now." They placed the ceramic house on a shelf in their living room. Not as a symbol of the marriage that failed, but as evidence of the Omega Leo had been before he learned to disappear into other people's needs. Reed Field's 10th anniversary show used the same title as the earlier exhibition, Return to Position. At the entrance, Leo wrote a new paragraph beneath the old one. A person's deepest loss is not always being forced out of a place. Sometimes it is spending years standing where he does not belong and calling the discomfort love. Return is not going backward. It is placing yourself where your work, your voice, and your life can finally carry your own name. The 10th anniversary show also launched a paid fellowship for designers returning after caregiving, illness, divorce, immigration, or other gaps that conventional firms like to call lack of commitment. Leo refused to name the fellowship after himself. Maya proposed the People Who Had Lives Award. The board chose a common title. One fellow was a 46-year-old Omega mother who had left architecture for 12 years to care for her disabled son. Another was a former construction manager rebuilding his career after cancer. A third had spent 5 years working nights while navigating an abusive marriage. Their portfolios were uneven. Their judgment was not. At the first orientation, Leo told them, "A gap is not empty space. It contains everything you survived, learned, and carried. Our job is not to pretend the gap never happened. It is to make sure nobody uses it to erase your ability." Afterward, a fellow approached him and said he had watched the Old River District interview while sitting in a courthouse hallway waiting for his own divorce hearing. "You said leaving was self-rescue," the fellow said. "I wrote it on the back of a parking receipt." Leo didn't know how to answer without turning the moment into a speech. So he took the fellow's hand and said, "I'm glad you got out." That night, Leo placed the ceramic house with no door beside the fellowship's first group photograph. Adrian found him there after everyone left. "Still no door?" Adrian asked. "I thought about adding one. I decided it doesn't need fixing. It only needs context." Adrian stood beside him, close enough to share warmth, not close enough to crowd. Leo rested his shoulder lightly against Adrian's. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For never making me feel like I owed you something for seeing me." Adrian turned to look at him. "That's not how love works. At least, it's not how I want it to work. You don't owe me for what I see. I'm the one who owes you for letting me look." Leo's throat tightened. He looked out at the exhibition, his name on one small line beside everyone else's. For years, he had wanted Alexander to choose him loudly enough that he would feel secure. Now he understood security differently. It was not being chosen once. It was being considered daily. A colleague who could disagree without stealing credit. A partner who could worry without issuing orders. A home where the light was left on because someone cared, not because one person was assigned to wait. Across the gallery, someone asked Leo what had been hardest about beginning again. He thought of the empty closet, the keys beside the divorce packet, and the red notification beneath Alexander's unanswered message. "The hardest part was not leaving," he said. "It was admitting I should have left sooner." The questioner looked sad. Leo smiled. "But later is not the same as never." Adrian waited without waving him over. He was talking to Maya, who was apparently arguing that the next exhibition needed pyrotechnics. Leo walked toward them when he was ready. He had once been Alexander's Omega. Kane Urban's invisible foundation. The person called only when something needed fixing. Those facts belonged to his history. They no longer defined his position. He was Leo Reed. Designer. Founder. Partner. An Omega who had learned that a door could be opened without becoming an obligation. A man who understood that leaving did not erase the years he had given. It simply stopped those years from taking more. He walked toward the man he loved, the alpha who had never once tried to own him, and beneath the gallery lights, surrounded by names that remained attached to their work, Leo Reed felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt returned. And this time, he had returned to himself.